Hey, how you doing?
I'm doing good, man. All right.
Cool.
Welcome to this podcast is Uncalled For.
What's uncalled for about it?
Well, you can't tell anybody this.
I'm listening.
Oh my God, what are you doing?
I worship Cthulhu just for the free beer.
Eggs are cheap and so are pancakes.
But you didn't even give a chance for a wild card spot.
What are we doing, Tijuana?
And you're like, what did you just say?
It's the exact sound I make when I'm...
That is uncalled for, Michael.
Well, the name of this podcast is Stuff Uncalled For?
This podcast is uncalled for.
Podcast, all right.
Yeah, that was the most ridiculous ending to that game that I've ever seen.
Oh my gosh, I gotta hurry up. Oh my gosh, I gotta hurry up. Oh my gosh, I gotta hurry up.
We're looking at each other in the eye. We're not going to say anything derogatory to the other person. And, of course, neither of us is drunk.
So I don't hear Pope Francis saying that he's a prophet, seer, and revelator.
What planet are these people on?
The book, take you back from.
See, this is a disgrace.
How'd that happen?
And it's got Chick-fil-A.
Don't think. I don't allow you to think.
Hey, we're getting somewhere.
And now, your host for this podcast, Mike Chernevsky.
Fuji!
Welcome to the podcast. So, as you probably know by now, if you're a regular listener to this podcast, that's the first podcast I ever did was a little thing called Sunflower Brew, which ran for about a year. The genesis behind that was Zach Aluya, who might have been the host of Sunflower Brew, approached me following the 2012 election, in which he had lost a state house race, and asked, would you like to do a podcast? And I'm like, sure. And like I said, it lasted about a year, and we did a video series with it as well. But today we're focusing more on the audio side of things. Because we used Podbean, the free service, you likely won't be able to find all of Sunflower Brew online. However, I still have all the episodes, so if you're interested in revisiting any old episodes of Sunflower Brew, please contact me. If you know me, you know my contact info, likely. So what we're going to do today is I'm going to play a retrospective of Sunflower Brew. I will play some of my favorites clips from the podcast. And it's interesting to think we did that back in 2012. Is currently 2021 when I'm recording this. And a lot of the issues that we talked about on that podcast are still very much issues to this day. So definitely worth a listen. So without further ado, our retrospective on Sunflower Brew.
I think the coalition of which it's been called of moderate Republicans and Democrats who have sort of joined forces in the past several years under both Democratic governors and the first 2 years of Governor Brownback's term to get things done or block the worst things that are proposed is gone. The Senate, which was the bastion of moderation because the 8 Democrats essentially teamed up with a majority of the Republican caucus that was more moderate to block some of the more egregious things that Governor Brownback was trying to do. A lot of those moderate Republicans were taken out in primaries. The House is now probably more moderate than the Senate. You have 33 Democrats who will now be able to caucus with maybe, not caucus with, but team up with, I don't know, maybe 15 moderate Republicans. But they're not going to be a majority in either house, even when you add the Democrats and the moderate Republicans together. You know, I say I went into sort of a funk when America reelected George W. Bush in 2004. But at the end of the day, I kind of decided that we had to have the second term of George W. Bush, or we would never have had President Obama. We might not have had a Republican, but we could have never gotten somebody like President Obama without the country being ticked off enough about how bad things got. And I think maybe that's where we are in Kansas.
So we're essentially at the tipping point, to use that phrase, and over the next 2 years, Kansas, and this is, I'm just extrapolating from what you talked about, that in the next 2 years, the average Kansas voter is going to see what a train wreck, Brownback policies are going to be. Obviously today he came out with the new budget mentioning an 8% cut to higher education. We're going to see a lot of that in the next 2 years. So what then is the plan from the Democratic standpoint to capture these essentially disenfranchised, persuadable voters? What can we do to get them to vote Democratic?
I think we need to concentrate on two things. We need to concentrate on energizing the Democratic base, and sometimes it takes crazy stuff happening on the other side. That is sort of what, if you want to use an analogy, that's what kind of lights the match, is crazy stuff happening on the other side, like it was happening nationally in 2006 and 2007 before President Obama was elected. To light that fire, then you have to have one or more inspirational candidates to carry the banner. And the match is going to be struck, I think. It's already been struck with people in the Democratic base like us. But I think you're going to see some moderate Republicans who, they still call themselves moderate Republicans. But I say, look, if you voted for President Obama twice and you didn't vote for Sam Brown back in 2010, you're not going to vote for him in 2014. If you voted for me, if you voted for you, guess what? You're not a Republican. You're a Democrat. And I think it's hard in Kansas because I think you're going to get to this later maybe, but you have a coalition of Republicans in Kansas. The reason I think Kansas is so red is because you've got, maybe unique among the 50 states, a combination of moderate Republicans whose republicanism goes back generations to the Civil War, and they really ought to be Democrats, but it's so hard to let go of that party affiliation for some of them. And the, right-wing extremists, the abortion people who, invaded Wichita 20 years ago, the anti-tax people, the Koch brothers. You've got both wings of the Republican Party with very strong presences here in Kansas.
In 2012, the Democrats had no candidate in the general election. That meant that the Republican candidate, whose only opposition was the Libertarian, was able to just skate right into his new term. He had no opposition, basically. So I wanted to make sure that that didn't happen again. I thought it was a travesty that the Democrats and the Democratic Party did not have a candidate. A lot of it had to do with the way that redistricting went. A lot of it had to do with the way that the short period of time for people to file. A lot of it had to do with other things that in scheduling the filing and scheduling the races. And the people who promised to run backed out. So we didn't have a candidate, and it was too late to find someone.
Like you said. So this time, you got a nice period, actually, a good 2-year period to work towards running. What are some of your goals? What do you want to accomplish in that period? How do you want to build your party structure, and what do you need?
Well, my goal is to make sure that the Democrats have a candidate on the ballot in 2014. That's my entire premise for running. I want to make sure that the Democrats in Johnson County, Wyandotte County, and part of Douglas County in the 3rd Congressional District have somebody to vote for in 2014. Also, I have run into a lot of people who say they are rhinos and will vote for a Democrat because the party is running a little bit too extreme to the right. So we want to give those people someone to vote for. And that's basically the main reason why I'm running.
Good. You know, again, it's probably pretty early in your campaign here, but what are a couple of things that you want to focus on besides just giving somebody the alternative vote? You know, what are your platform? What's your platform?
The platform is clean environment, good education, safe workplace, secure retirement, and top flight health care.
Okay. So overall, how would you grade Representative Yoder?
F.
I agree with that. You know, with his vote against the funding for the Sandy relief bill last week, you know, there's the Steve Rose article about, don't judge him on that. Well, you know what? I think you should judge him on that. There was no reason to vote against that. For me, that is the definition of what government is, or the responsibility of government is to help our citizens in need. And to vote against that, I think, is just a real travesty, as you put it. So
people who are elected as representatives are representing people. They're not representing governments or states or corporations or non-human entities. Right. They're representing the people of the district, and they should vote that helps the people.
Definitely. Yeah, there's not to get too nerdy on it, but you know, Cicero, the orator from ancient Rome, said the will of the people is the supreme law of the land. So, you know, that's what really they should be representing.
All right, well, we're going to launch into the beer discussion now.
All right, good part.
Well, we talked a little bit about you brewing your own beer, but why did you get, you talked about why you got into it. Now it's a kind of the cost thing, but what challenges do the average home brewers face when they're getting into, I mean, you're now at that point where you're in a group and you're buying big, 30-gallon batches. Right. What's one of the first things that the average home brewer faces when they start opening that kit and they say, I got all this stuff, what do I do?
It's amazing how many resources are out there. It's one of those communities where there's way more than you'll ever need. It's easy to find somebody that's willing to help and share with you. But the biggest challenge, I think, is probably understanding what the process is. A lot of people will jump right in, and that's what I did. You just, you get a one-page sheet of instructions, and it's really easy to do. So, it's really easy to get started. But you'll be, an hour into your first one and realize, oh, I should maybe do this, or I need to do this, or, you just haven't been through the process and don't know it. And you always feel like, oh, I need that next piece of equipment to make this easier or better or faster or whatever it is. It's one of those things that, you can always do more, but you can have a really basic system and you can find instructions and, just a regular ceramic pot that everybody has or a chili pot or something. And you can get there from there and have some decent beer. Yeah, that's the nice thing at Barley's and
Bacchus and Barley Corn.
Bacchus
and Barley Corn over there. They have some great kits. And, my wife bought me for my birthday one of the the Mr. Beer kit. Mm-hmm. And I turned that out, and it was watery and but it was foolproof, and that was the thing. And then I expanded into that, and I had a buddy that he had all the equipment, so I just went over there, bought the kit. So that was a really nice experience. And, you kind of equated it to, cooking or an art. And I think that's really, it's more like baking, because it's that exact science, but you still can play around with it and create some really fun stuff. Talk a little bit about that group that you're involved in. How'd that get started, and what's if they have a name or anything like that?
Sure.
Tell us a little bit about that.
We are, to make sure we're not running afoul of any state laws or federal laws. It is a home brewing system, so we have a name, and it's a equipment co-op. So it is not a brewing system, but we call ourselves Beer Ops Brewing.
Nice.
So basically, we've all been pooling together money for some amount of time, and then buy equipment as needed. At the moment, there's 7 of us, and like I said, it basically got started as a couple of people, I think, had decided they wanted to kind of start doing it and getting into it. They had been doing some beer judging at competitions. They knew that I'd done some home brewing for about a year, and so asked if I wanted to join up with them. And like I said, we got started about a year ago, so we'll see where the process goes in the future as far as whether it's something we look at, filling out the paperwork and doing all that and commercializing and at that point. But I think you're allowed something like 60 gallons or something. I mean, it's pretty lenient, and
yeah,
the rules are vague in a couple of areas, and people have been fighting about whether you're allowed to take them out of the home or serve them for free at competitions and stuff. And actually, one of the guys in the group is also a lawyer, and I know he's working on some bills this year to make sure that kind of expand the capabilities of what we can and can't do.
Yeah. That is, Kansas has adjusted a lot of its liquor laws here in the past 2 years. The homebrew hasn't been touched, but some of the microbrew stuff, you can actually, if you are a licensed microbrew and you go through the TTB process on the federal level, you can brew a tremendous amount of beer. And the winery the same. I think it's something like 100,000 gallons before you have to move into that next step. And one of my clients who is a winery, he's like, there's no way I'd ever produce 100,000 gallons of wine. That's a tremendous amount of wine. So, well, that's cool. What was some of the products that you produced from that group? What kind of typical beers?
Yeah, we've been jumping all over the place. For a while, we just been purchasing kits that we'd done, and then we sort of experimented and moved on from that, and we sort of just rotated each time who was the head, the theoretical head brewer, and so it was their choice on the recipe. So we added more of the adding your own grains, adding some of your extras to it. We did one that was a hot porter, a chili porter, so it had chili seasoning and I think something like 6 or 8 entire Hershey chocolate bars in it or something. Came out really well, actually. A little dry, but we've been all over the place with whether we're doing lagers. A couple of people have refrigeration equipment just to do lager-style beers. We've done IPAs, a couple of different porters. So we've been all over the place. But in the last month, we've sort of been isolating down to what we're going to consider our standard, our year-round beers, and we're going to try to start out with 3 and then add a few more from there. So we're going to do something similar to what we're drinking now, actually, a Belgian blonde, a little lighter beer than this, an IPA, and I can't remember what the third one we're going to do is. So.
Well, just for clarification, would you describe for our listeners that may not know or who are just listening for the political discussion, how do you actually brew a lager? I mean, it's a specific type of beer, and it has to be brewed in a specific way. Most people just hear, American lager, and they just think of watery Coors Light or Miller Lite. What does it mean to have a lager?
Sure. My understanding is lager is a German word meaning like locker or storage. Mm-hmm. And for the most part, the way it used to be done is after you brewed and added your yeast, you would store it in, a long time ago, caves, but cool caves, and let it sit for months and months and months. And that's basically what you're trying to replicate now is instead of the biggest difference between you have an ale or a lager is your yeast. One's called top fermenting, the other one's bottom fermenting. That gets into the chemistry, and neither are really accurate terms as they are. But so what you're doing is after you add your yeast, typically you're having them at room temperature or slightly cooler. With a lager, you're putting them in a refrigerated equipment and generally doing it, for the most part, not far above freezing, and letting it sit for a long, long time, as opposed to with most home brews, once you add the yeast, you're probably talking 3 weeks before you bottle it. In this case, you're probably talking 2 to 3 months in general. Like everything else, it varies, but that's the basic gist behind it.
No, kind of just basic chemistry question. Probably with the lower temperature, it causes the yeast to be less active and produce the carbon dioxide at a slower rate and consume the sugar at a slower rate.
It does, yeah. And so when your yeast is active, it's heating it up. I mean, it's a metabolic process, and so you get some of these. It's kind of getting into the chemistry again, but you get more esters, more different flavors with the yeast. And when you chill it down and you're working from a very low level, then it's basically just doing its one function very slowly, and you're not getting this kind of wild craziness that goes on. And that's why lagers are generally very, very crisp taste to them. They don't have a lot of the extra stuff going on.
Both conservatism and liberalism in the American setting are mainstream ideologies, and both are versions of democratic thought, liberal democratic thought or conservative democratic thought. And in the American setting, this gets confusing because of the use of the terms, but what passes for conservatism in America is really a variety of liberalism. Conservatism tends to stress power and hierarchy and social authority, but liberalism is based on individualism, and the rhetoric that modern American conservatives use, for the most part, is a variation of the rhetoric that 19th century liberals used. In fact, Friedrich Hayek, whom conservatives revere for his book in the 1940s, The Road to Serfdom, once wrote an article entitled Why I Am Not a Conservative. He said he was a liberal, and certainly in modern American politics, Ronald Reagan would have been a liberal. Liberalism tends to emphasize the individual and individual rights and be skeptical of government power over the individual and that sort of thing.
And that's kind of an interesting from kind of a marketing standpoint, because those are the things that, the modern conservatives, those are the ideas that they embrace, the individual, the contempt for a main government, and then they kind of leave off this kind of class issue, I guess.
Yes.
So where would Governor Brownback fall? We briefly discussed beforehand, that the new right, the religious right, in this kind of modern vernacular, what is his kind of standing? Where does he fall?
Well, to some extent, he floats along below the radar. He's not as flamboyant as some of the people. He's a crony, ideologically, of Rick Perry in Texas. They seem to... he's not, I would say, intellectually challenged the way Rick Perry appears to be, but... he is a polite, courteous, hard right religious conservative. And most of his ideology does flow, it seems to me, from his religious views. Now, this doesn't say anything about his sincerity or his decency as a human being. I think I'm not a specialist on Sam Brownback at all. I've never actually met him, but he strikes me as being a man who's utterly sincere and who's committed to what he's doing, but also committed to a political ideology that most Americans would probably not accept if they recognized it in its pure form. His policies are strongly pro-business, and it's okay to be pro-business, but not at the expense of working people. And his policies will ultimately, if they are implemented, as I suspect they will be, he and a number of other Republican governors, Rick Perry is one, and Bobby Jindal is another, and there are probably 10 of them that are moving in the direction of doing away with income taxes and taxes on business and spreading more taxes to the working people, all under the guise of lowering taxes. It does lower them, certainly, for the wealthier group. But he also is firmly committed to his version of morality. And his religious background's an interesting one. I understand that he grew up as a Methodist.
Yeah, and then he converted to Catholicism.
He converted to Roman Catholicism, but it's a particularly harsh version of Roman Catholicism.
Yes, Opus Dei.
Opus Dei, the extraordinarily reactionary wing of the most conservative part of Catholic theology. And ironically, some of the religious rights, the fundamentalist evangelicals in this country, that include large numbers of Protestants plus some of the more conservative Catholics, do reflect teachings that have been called dominionist or Christian Reconstructionism, in which their ideal state would have as office holders only Christians, that is, Christians as they interpret them, not...
And they would expand that to include the Judeo-Christians, or some would, or some would not.
No, they talk about the Judeo-Christians, but the dominionists actually would think that office holders and voters should be limited to those who are Bible-believing Christians from their point of view. But now, politically, they ally themselves with Catholics, and now we see with Mormons and with Jews, conservative Jews. But when it comes right down to it, the theocracy they profess, or that they seek, is one that's centered exclusively on Christianity, but a very limited interpretation of Christianity. And they were the ones who developed the notion, and you studied history and you know the extent to which this is a misrepresentation, the notion that the founders established American government to be a biblical nation, and to restrict the power of the federal government, when actually the Constitution was written to increase the power of the federal government, to hold down some of the more radical policies of the states. R.J. Rushdoony was a conservative Presbyterian theologian in this country, the late R.J. Rushdoony, Rousas John Rushdoony, and some other scholars, and even some who supported most of his views, thought of him as clinically insane, for which you can make a pretty good case if you look what he believed. He believed, for example, not only should office holding and voting be limited to a very narrow group, but there should be a huge expansion of the death penalty. And not only, and certainly Governor Brownback does not subscribe to this, and most fundamentalist evangelicals don't. But the mindset is reflected nonetheless from these tendencies, and these were helped to be spread by the late Francis Schaeffer, who was also a conservative Presbyterian, and his son Frank, who, by the way, has now recanted and has written a series of books, one of which is called Crazy for God, and the subtitle is something like How I Helped Start the Religious Right and learned to take it all or most of it all back and love Jesus anyway, or something like that. But his expansion of the death penalty would include not only the existing offenses, but adultery and blasphemy and homosexuality and even children who are disrespectful to their parents. So these are the kinds of ideas that fall under the clinically insane category of his thoughts.
So that's, when the people talk about, in Kansas they use Brown-Bakistan and they use the American Taliban, that's really not far off if they're a true believer in this ideology. So that's actually a bit terrifying, and I think most people just hear that and they're like, oh, that's just the left being kind of reactionary. And
that's right.
But it's from what you're telling me, this is, if they are truly holding these beliefs, that's actually very terrifying.
Well, Frank Schaeffer, who was Francis Schaeffer's son, encouraged his father to encourage the evangelical leaders of the 70s and 80s to become political, people like Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson. They were evangelists and they were not political. And American Protestants, evangelicals, tended to stay away from politics up until this period because they accepted the biblical admonition to separate themselves from worldly things. Insofar as they were politically active, they tended to be New Deal Democrats for economic reasons.
Right.
But at first, Francis Schaeffer resisted his son's pleas. His son now was in his late teens, and he was overzealous, and he said, we need to get these people politicized, and we need to make abortion a key issue. And Francis Schaeffer said, I don't care about abortion. It's a Catholic issue. American Protestants weren't concerned about it at that time. But finally, Frank persuaded his father, and this is Frank's own telling, he persuaded his father to sell the notion that abortion should absolutely be outlawed, and it's murder, to Falwell and Robertson and the whole crew and the whole group. And it all went from there. In fact, that one issue has become the turning point, the litmus test issue that binds all these groups together.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, you look in Kansas and you look back to 94 and 93, that you could say that was the swing point for when the Democrats started to lose control.
Well, Schaeffer became, in the words of Frank, both he and Francis didn't just come close to the line, they actually crossed the line into open sedition. They talked of revolution, and now you heard echoes of that in 2012,
Rick Perry.
Secession and so forth. And fighting the federal government, and we want to buy guns with armor-piercing bullets, not to hunt, but to protect ourselves against the police if they come after us. And all.
Which is an insane concept in and of itself. And then the whole 10th Amendment nullification. You have a number of these states that are trying to pass laws where they supersede the federal government, but.
Represents queer. It can also represent questioning. Sometimes you'll see QQ. Those who are questioning their gender or sexual identities. I is intersex and A is for ally or asexual. And, the addition of those, like the term queer has many different definitions that can be attached to. Some use queer as an umbrella term to encompass the entire LGBT community. Since we know that gender and sexual identities are distinct, but queer can be a way of putting everyone under one umbrella. But queer can also be used as an identity itself, whereas someone who may be genderqueer and someone who doesn't connect with either the binary of male or female genders, they may connect with both genders. And so queer kind of takes on a complicated...
I was going to say that's a complicated answer, for an umbrella term there. I mean, particularly, you were talking about the gender specific and... beyond that. Okay.
So queer can represent many. And yeah, I think when we see these additional letters, the whole alphabet to LGBTQIA, it can be much more than that. And its intention is to be more inclusive of the complex gender and sexual identities that we are coming to know better.
So you're saying it's not black and white? You're not just
exactly.
lesbian, you're not just gay, you're not just... Okay, all right. You're not just straight. All right, well, yeah. So Sean, you said you're with the Q&A Club. What does that mean for you? I mean, Jonathan kind of almost gave us a almost textbook kind of a psychological definition of it. But from a student standpoint, or what's your kind of feeling on the Q&A?
I look at it like, I'm gay and I like guys. And lesbian, you like women. And transgender, I really don't know that much because I'm not trans. And like guys who dress like girls, what is that called?
Cross-dressing.
Yeah, cross-dressing.
No, is there a difference? No, is that, and that's a kind of interesting point. Is there something different between somebody who is transgender and somebody who may just be a transvestite? I don't know. Is this getting too far into the weeds when you're talking about this, splitting hairs, or is it?
Well, how long do you have?
Well, we try to keep it at 20 minutes, but we can go on for a while.
But yes, there is a difference. The term transgender is used as an umbrella term as well, and that usually encompasses people who are cross-dressers, people who identify as transsexual, and people who identify as genderqueer. The term transvestite itself is becoming more of an appropriate term anymore. Some people may still connect that to an identity, but cross-dresser would be the more appropriate term to refer to someone.
So it's almost a derogatory term.
Yeah, and you may hear some people within the community who may take that on as their identity, and I say respect that. But it kind of brings up these connotations of what we've seen in media, the Rocky Horror Picture Show, and these negative representations of trans people. So the transgender itself, though, is that broader umbrella term for people whose gender identity doesn't match with the expected male-female binary.
Okay. And Sean, kind of back to you a little bit. You said that the Q&A, the A is for the ally. With your group there, I mean, how many? What's the size of your group? How many people are in there? And...
Last semester there was only 5. That was because 2 other people from the group wasn't really doing nothing to promote the club. Which this semester, me and my friend Ryan and we have stepped in and took over, and our group has grew from 5 to 22.
Oh, very nice.
So we changed the club where it's still a meeting, but it's funner.
So you're looking more for the kind of the social aspect and the educational aspect to it.
Yes.
Yeah, that's always a great way to bring people in. I use beer, so
we try to use food.
Yeah, food will always work too. Well, let's lead into something. And I was telling you before we started this that I'm not a sports guy in general. Right. But I listen to your program all week, and then I kind of listen to your competitors. And one of my favorite segments that was this week, they were busting you a little bit about picking the Arsenal as your English Premier League team. And one of the things you mentioned, and this kind of ties into our conversation, is that Johnny's Downtown has actually started opening on Saturdays at 6 o'clock in the morning so they can start broadcasting or having people in for the English Premier League games. So we're talking about sports and politics, sports and economics. It seems strange that the English Premier League is now having a direct impact on Kansas City's economic base. Yeah. So that's kind of interesting. What are your thoughts about that? I mean, just from that kind of small standpoint.
It's fascinating, and Johnny's doesn't do this every weekend, but if they get a group of soccer fans that reach out to them, they've developed, I'm a member of a nerd alert here, but I'm a member of a fan club for Arsenal in town called the KC Gooners, and we got a guy that kind of runs the show for us, and whenever we can get enough people together, he'll call the manager at Johnny's and say, hey, can you throw the doors open for us this weekend because we're going to bring 30 people. And they section off an area for us. And for today was a season opener, so we had 30 to 40 Arsenal fans. All, there was maybe 2 guys that were actually from England. Everybody else was, a Kansas City person that's just a soccer fan that picked Arsenal as a team. And, there are obviously a lot of other fan groups like that for other EPL teams. But yeah, there's a sports bar. I don't know how they're doing economically, but there's a sports bar that opened in Overland Park called the Football Club.
Yeah.
And their whole business model is, based on trying to attract soccer fans to come watch their games. And it is interesting, the games that are taking place halfway across the world are drawing fan support even in, Kansas City, of all places. And it's a niche. It's still very much a niche. I would say the vast majority of Kansas Cityans don't even know who Arsenal is.
But do you think because of the success of Sporting KC, we are now the EPL is now starting to attract more people, and you may see more of this? That bars throwing open the doors at 9:00 in the morning, just so 10, 20 fans can come in and check out a game.
My answer is yes. I mean, I think it's growing, and I think it will continue. I think it's kind of a self-perpetuating cycle now. I think Sporting Kansas City's success has impacted maybe, soccer knowledge in this town a little bit, or had an impact on soccer knowledge in this town, so where people start to say, well, gosh, this is fun. Maybe I should learn more about the sport and some of the best teams out there and pick an English team because their season's it's different than sporting season, so you can follow it all year round. But I think the biggest thing when it comes to that has been, the advent of the internet and telecommunications. This whole concept of a global village, it really is. I mean, I started playing soccer really in high school, but I had no venue for watching the best soccer players in the world. I mean, it wasn't on TV anywhere. Now, I really became a diehard soccer fan 7 years ago with the World Cup in Germany, and after the World Cup I used to watch the World Cup every 4 years and have fun with it, but then after that World Cup I thought, well, I don't want to wait for another 4 years.
Right, it was much like the Olympics. It's come on, you'd maybe catch some of the obscure games or the obscure sports, and you were like, oh, okay, maybe build a little interest from there. So.
But then they were gone.
Yeah.
But this time around, after the Germany World Cup 7 years ago, I realized, wait a second, I have Fox Soccer Channel on my cable. I have, games are getting televised on ESPN and ESPN2 now, so I can actually watch these matches. And once that became reality, then it was like, well, I might as well become a fan of this. And then, the games are earlier in the morning, so they don't conflict with the other sporting events that we watch in America. It kind of gives you something to do when you roll out of bed. I think with all that, that's kind of causing more, now that we literally are a global village, I think people have started to become more aware and interested.
Okay. But, let's narrow that down. I think it's a great, conversation about the marketing and the merchandising sales and then television rights, because you get into the cross combination with Fox, and now today they were broadcasting on NBC, so there's a lot of licenses right there. There's a transfer of millions and millions of dollars and potentially billions of dollars over time. But rake him over the coals, victimize him.
We'll bring it.
So we really need to have him step up and score some points for us. So Matt's going to come down and bring the presentation here. So Matt, if you would, let's see what you got. Now, Matt, while we're doing this, you can just set it on the side. Did you do spare ribs, St. Louis style?
Yep, St. Louis style.
Okay. And Jeremy, Charlie, you want to chime in on that real quick? What is the difference between baby back spare ribs, St. Louis style, all that stuff?
Baby backs come from the upper part of the ribs, towards the spine of the hog. Baby backs generally are more known for having more meat. They're smaller. They're going to be more curved. The bone's going to be more curved. So as you're plating it, putting it in the box, you need to keep that in mind. You don't want to stack it too high so the box won't close. Spare ribs generally don't have as much meat, but they're more known for having better flavor. Mm-hmm. So it's really kind of 50-50. And over our competition lifetime, I've kind of gone back and forth.
Yeah, Charlie's our rib man.
And I'm back onto baby backs. The thing about doing spares, and I was glad to hear that with the St. Louis cut, if you do spares, cutting them St. Louis, and that's basically taking the ribs and kind of squaring them off and making that more of a rectangle shape. That's going to help your ribs be equal length. And generally you'll cut from the middle part of the ribs and leave the ends alone. But that will help you to make them more uniform if you cut them St. Louis style. But yeah, so I kind of go back and forth. And I would say On the competition circuit, it's probably 50-50. I mean, you'll talk to some people, they like spares, some like, but yeah.
I know when I go out to eat, and this is just commercial restaurants, I prefer the spare ribs to the baby backs, but just because I think I get more for my money. But okay, so let's go in on with this. This is you said baby backs.
No, these are St. Louis spares.
St. Louis spares. Yeah. All right, we got the first up is the appearance. So walk us through the appearance here.
The first thing I'm going to say that is he turned his ribs in upside down. So
okay.
I see the flap meat, and I'm looking. I see a couple of paint strokes in them, and that's one of the things you look for as a competition judge. Is you want to see the bark, you want to see them turned upside correctly, and you want to see the smoke ring.
Okay, and before we go into that, smoke ring for those uninitiated is what? Just a brief description.
It's a chemical reaction.
I know
it's a chemical reaction between the nitrates on the meat and the moisture and smoke in the smoke chamber,
which actually creates a visible ring that is pink and
it's
then
a pink.
red.
It's about 1/4 of an inch deep. Anything other than that might be artificially created. That's for another podcast.
Another bunch of cheaters again. All right. So we're looking at it. Brush strokes. The flat part of the meat. Bark. What else?
It does look moist.
It definitely. The color looks good. Yeah, I can see some of the brush strokes, but that's an easy fix. But I think the color looks good. Like Jeremy said, they're upside down. I still don't think you definitely want to turn them in meat side up. But even for upside down, I don't think it looks horrible. I mean, I don't think this would get a bad score.
No, I'm sorry, I don't. What about we're looking at this and we see that the meat has pulled away from the ends of the bone here. That's what is that?
Playing.
Okay, yeah. What is that? What is that an indicator of?
That means that you should be getting a tender rack of ribs.
Okay.
Also, when you look at it, unfortunately, the people at home can't see this. It looks like it came from one rack of rib instead of they took a couple of racks of ribs and they pulled out the best pieces and put them in the box.
Which is you're going to get knocked for that, or
you will get knocked for that.
Okay, so the judges want to see that you cooked a solid piece of meat.
It's all about uniformity and symmetry.
Okay.
In the box. So yeah, like you can see, like Jeremy was saying, you can kind of see the little flap right here. Which being upside down, you're going to see that, but it does look uniform. You can tell these all came from the same rack, and I think the meat pulling away from the bone, like Jeremy said, it's an indication that it's going to be a tender rib, and I think they all look uniform. They're all pulled away from the bone the same way. It's very symmetrical looking. You definitely want, if you don't have a rack, you don't want to turn in some ribs that are pulled away from the bone and some don't. All 6 ribs here have pulled away from the bone, so it's very symmetrical.
Really cool. Yeah.
And I think in the past competitions that when we've done ribs, that we've actually done that where we've mixed and matched kind of some of them, and so they know right away.
That has happened on 18th Swine.
Yeah, and it's tough. It's tough. So sometimes you don't. It's hard to find ribs that are all from the same rack if they if you can't. Sometimes things happen.
We knew a guy who turned in 3 pieces of briskets from different briskets.
How it goes. I did. Pulled pork. Pulled pork's a little different because it's all shredded because I shoved it all in there. But all right, so what are we going to judge it on the appearance here? And again, no hard feelings. Doc may go upstairs and cry, but this is about us getting better. So give it to him.
It still looks good. I'm going to give that to Doc. It still looks good. I'm going to give it a 7.
Okay.
It's got all the things that I'm looking for. It looks like it's moist. It looks like it's from the same rack of ribs. Like you said before, all the ribs, the meat has pulled away from the bone. It looks like it's very tender. It's visually appealing. I'm going to give it a 7.
Okay. Charlie, you're the rib man.
I would also give it a 7, and I commend Doc for this because, like I said, the first thing I did notice was the ribs being upside down. But it could have gone much worse being upside down. But I'm kind of curious. I want to flip it over and see what it looks like meat side up to see how good it looks.
So what's he really hiding?
But I would give it. I would give it definitely a 7.
Okay, so
solid 7.
All right, so let's go.
Zach, what are you going to give it?
I'm inexperienced at this, but I think it's a good looking rib. It's pulled away. It's got kind of that nice sheen to it. I look at it as something like. Some of them that I've seen, they just look like lollipops, and that just looks gross.
Yes.
To me, this looks like meat, and it looks like it's been smoked, and so it'll be a good taste. And it doesn't have that look that I'm going to pick it up and shake it, and it's just going to drop right off the bone.
That's true.
I know a lot of people that when they want it from the backyard, they want it just falling off the bone.
I like my ribs that have a little bit of, I hate to use it, meat to it. I mean, they can stand up. It's something I can taste, and it's not something that's just mush.
I'll say this: they have a very caveman-like appeal.
Yes,
they've got the bone. You just kind of feel like Fred Flintstone. You just want to grab it off there. And one thing before, as we're getting ready to pull them off, and I'll mention this too as we get into to taste. And this really would apply to ribs and brisket. Probably not so much chicken and pork, because you're cutting the meat from one bigger piece of meat. Mm-hmm. When you're cutting ribs and brisket, you want to make sure that you cut them clean through, because the judges are trained as you're pulling your rib off, or when we get to brisket, as you're pulling your piece of brisket out. If the individual pieces of meat are somehow still connected,
mm-hmm.
and you pull it out of there, say I'm pulling a rib out of here and it's still connected to another rib, you can kind of shake it if you want it to fall out, but if they're still connected, that is considered one piece of meat. So right. Here, there's six bones in the box. If I pulled one of those bones out and they're still connected, then that means there's going to be 5 left, or there's going to be 4 left.
Not enough for the next.
And that's an automatic disqualification.
Right.
Clean cuts.
They would come out to your tent and they tell you you're disqualified. You do not get any points for that.
Yeah. So as you're doing that, there's 2 ways to kind of address that. 1, make sure you cut them all the way through. But 2, usually you can fit. You might be able to fit like an extra rib or 2 in your box if you can do it. Here there's 6. If you put a 7th one, or you can fit an 8th one in there, then that wouldn't be an issue. But really, the other thing too is when you judge, if you do pick up a piece of meat, you have to pull that meat off. So if somebody did pick it up and it is connected, you can't put it back in there and say, "Oh, I'll find another one that's not connected to another rib." So
once you touch it, it's yours. Huh?
It's yours. Right.
Number wise, what are we looking at here?
Okay. I would have to say he's missing the bark. Something happened to the bark in the smoke ring. Tenderness, 9. Pull apart beautifully. I'm going to have to go back on my taste now that I'm thinking about it. I'm going to have to give it a 7.
Okay. Charlie? And I'll come back to you and get your critique on the taste and everything like that. But Charlie, what do you got?
Tenderness right now?
Yep.
I would give it a 9 as well. I think that just like Jeremy said, when you pull it apart, it shouldn't fall apart, and it shouldn't be. You should be able to grab it and pull it apart gently without a lot of pressure. And it didn't fall apart, and it wasn't too hard. So I would give it a 9.
And I'm going to go back to what, when I was picking up that piece, it may have been just how I was picking it up. But I mean, yeah, I like the fat. I love fat. One of my favorite meals is actually bone marrow. You scrape it out and put it on bread, which is kind of gross for some people, but I love fat. This, it's not dry. It's not... when I pick it up, it's still got some tooth to it. I can bite into it, I can chew it. It's nice.
It's not disintegrating in your mouth.
No, it's it feels like I'm eating meat.
Yes.
Not grandma's slurry. So okay, so 9's on the tenderness.
Yes.
Charlie, what's on your taste, and then we'll start back with Jeremy and give me your critique on the taste.
I like the taste. It's got a little kick at the end of it. There was. From a judging standpoint, it was okay. It was okay. Let me rephrase that. It was better than okay. It was better than average. However, it's okay. I mean, it's a little bit better than okay. As you can see, I'm waffling between okay and better than okay. I'm going to give it a 7. The reason why is there's not enough bark. There's no oomph to it. It's good, but it's not great.
Okay. Charlie? Sorry, as I shove some more in my mouth. Sorry.
I would give it. I'm actually on the same page as Jeremy. I would give it a 7 also. There's a flavor there that kind of seems overpowering to me. That's really kind of coming through. I don't know if it's either paprika or maybe cumin. I don't know what's in it, but there's something that's kind of not a balance. There's something that's really coming through.
Did you use half strap, the paprika?
I used the smoked paprika.
Okay. Yeah. But I'm sorry.
It was, and it's not. It's when we were talking about earlier the balance. There's some flavor, and it's not a bad flavor, but it's just kind of over. It's more than everything else. It's not as balanced, but it's not too much heat, and it's not too hot, and it's not too sweet. I think it's a middle of the road flavor that I've got coming through there, but it is distinct and kind of coming through stronger than everything else.
I would have to say it's got kind of a Worcestershire overtone to it. It's almost like You used a little bit A1 in there. No? Okay. Worcestershire.
Oh, dirty words there, A1. We'd have to kick you out of the building if you used A1.
John Willingham's brisket sauce is almost A1.
There's nothing worse. I grew up on a cattle farm, and I think it is sacrilege if you put A1 on a steak.
Yeah.
I will track you down and jab a pin in your throat if you...
And there lies the crux of KCBS judging.
If you do that to a cow.
What you like and what other people like are two different things.
Yes, that's true. That's true. Charlie, what's your score on it?
Were we on taste?
Yes.
I give it a 7.
7. Generally, Ryan, when he does something, he does a big, bold flavor. He uses a lot of pepper, and I think that I've become acclimated to that, and I really like that. Uh-huh. And I think that's what's missing here, because I'm judging that on what he does for his ribs and everything like that. I really like his ribs when he does this really kind of smoky and spicy, and so I'm judging it on that. But I would give it a 7. I think it's, for me, it's kind of middle of the road, and now it's kind of got a back kind of heat that's there, and it's carrying over, and I like that, but it doesn't have a sweetness to it. But I don't know if that mixes well with the brisket, with the beef.
You do want a balance of flavors. I mean, you are coming from... You don't
dishonor the cow.
Do not dishonor the cow. That's actually a really good point. When you're talking about KCBS meats, the meat should taste like what it's supposed to taste like. If you have barbecue candy, that's a little too much. I mean, it's a little too sweet. It's a little too sweet. And you're not going to hit the middle of the road.
So on to our actual topic here. That event prompted you to really get into community organizing and grassroots campaigns. Define grassroots campaign. What does that mean? I mean, for you, it was you starting to write letters and getting involved. Mm-hmm. But, I mean, for most people, they were just like, they hear that term, but they don't really know what it means. What does it mean?
Grassroots is really getting down to the root of your culture, or not culture, society, root of your communities. Mm-hmm. When I'm a grassroots community organizer, I get down and I talk to people on a local level. I organize you start small and you build big. You start in somebody's basement talking about an issue. And then the next thing you know, you're holding a community event. And then you're talking, you're bringing in community leaders.
Okay. So that kind of then...
It's everyday people getting involved.
So is that the term then community organizer interchangeable with the kind of the volunteer grassroots type of thing? Or is it, could be...
Not really, because you could be a leader in a grassroots movement, I guess, and not really be a true community organizer. Community organizing is a lot of work, and that's what people hear grassroots community organizer, and they think
you're a jobless hippie.
Jobless hippie, and I'm always looking for that next contract and job. It comes through the relationships I build, and those relationships take time and work and effort.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Okay, so what do you view as kind of your greatest success as a grassroots organizer or community organizer? I'm sorry.
No, it's
either one.
The biggest thing what means the most to me are the relationships I built. I'm very proud of, from everybody, the basic, the everyday, your neighbors who I meet on your doorsteps. Like I'm very proud of the relationships I built with those, all the way up to, elected officials in high positions or in organizations, leaders in organizations. I think that's what defines success for me. I mean, if you look at issues that I've done, I was pretty proud of the fact that as the Kansas team lead for the National Breast Cancer Coalition, and being a registered Democrat, I was able to get 4 of our congressional delegates to co-sponsor a piece of legislation for me.
3 out of the 4?
Yes, 3 out of the 4. The holdout was Tim Huell's camp.
No, that's a shocker.
Yeah, I know. Isn't it crazy? I don't think. Yeah.
So what was that piece of legislation then?
It was supporting the end of breast cancer act through the National Breast Cancer. It is a piece of breast cancer legislation. It is accelerating the End of Breast Cancer Act through the National Breast Cancer Coalition that established a commission to look at seed grants and look at ways to prevent breast cancer rather than finding the next drug or whatever.
Right.
And preventing metastatic tumors. It really gets into this whole deal with the National Breast Cancer Coalition that I do. But that was basically.
And we'll touch on that organization here in a second. But I'm kind of interested. How do you approached the 4, and this seems like a no-brainer. Preventative measures to obviously prevent, stop breast cancer before it starts. That seems like a win-win for everybody involved. I mean, obviously it's grant money for research. Not that big of a deal.
We're talking about money.
Right, and we're talking about money, and so that's always a big issue.
But the thing, how do you get them to do it?
Yeah, well, 1, how do you get them to do it? And then 2, when you have an individual, because this seems like such a no-brainer, that has pushed back and says, no, I won't support this legislation, what do you say to that?
Well, first of all, I know the piece of legislation when I go in there. And I tell them, it doesn't, like in this case, it didn't allocate any new money. The money came from the already funded executive branch and established a commission. And it's, it had a sunset, timed out. In other words, like it wasn't a never-ending thing and all this stuff. But it took a lot of work. I met with representatives in their D.C. office, their staff. I met with their local staff. I attended town halls. I used social media. I emailed. I called. I'm pretty lucky I didn't get a restraining order. But that's what it takes. And there was a joke we had when I was working a political campaign or for President Obama's campaign in Denver. They're like, if you don't have 2 restraining orders by the end of this, you're not doing a good job. And it was, of course, a joke that we had in our office. But that's what you feel like. You go back so many times that you really develop relationships and people know that you're going to show up and that you're counting on them to do something.
So, Mike, what do we got up on the beer?
All right, let's talk beer now. Today's beer is Weston Brewery Company's 1842 Porter Brew Labs number 5. It's an American porter inspired from the now wavering English porter. The American porter is the ingenious creation from that. Thankfully, with lots of innovation and originality, American brewers have taken this style to a new level. Whether it is highly hopping the brew using smoked malts or adding coffee or chocolate to complement the burnt flavor associated with this style. Some are even barrel-aged in bourbon or whiskey barrels, and the hop bitterness range is quite wide from most, but most are balanced. Many are just easy drinking session porters as well.
You'll hear me re-pouring mine because Matt and I have finished our beers, and we made Megan talk the entire time, so she unfortunately didn't have the opportunity to drink her beer. So, Megan, what we... you can visit their website, www.westonirish.com. There wasn't any information on their website. It is by their brew lab, and that's kind of their small batch seasonal. So they didn't have a lot of information on there about the porter, but it is an American porter, like Mike just described. And Megan, we use a matrix that we stole from somebody else, and it goes by look, smell, taste, finish, and mouthfeel. So generally, what we kind of do now is, as you described it earlier. What'd you say it looked like?
I'm not sure.
To me, it looks like coffee.
Yeah, it looks like coffee. It's a nice coffee and gets a good smell.
It's like a maple syrup. It's dark, but it's transparent as well. It's kind of nice.
Yeah, and the smell. What are you catching out of it? What kind of notes are? I think that's the proper term, notes. It's kind of a wine thing. Matt, and you can jump in here too if you want. Cocoa. Yeah.
Cocoa coffee.
Yeah, I get that. There's something is there a little citrus kind of? And then the taste, you definitely get that kind of coffee, chocolatey note. It's not too
caramely.
Yeah, a little caramely, not too
chalky to my taste.
Yeah, not too strong. I like a lot of. Some porters are pretty heavy, and others are very light. And then the finish and mouthfeel. That's generally talks about how much it kind of leaves at the back of your tongue. And this one's nice and drinkable. I wouldn't want to. We're drinking out of the Bomber, which is the 1 pint, 6 fluid ounce Bomber. And I don't think I'd want to take down too many of these, but it's definitely a decent after meal beer.
It's almost like an iced coffee. I almost feel like I'm drinking like an iced mocha coffee. It's very good.
Yeah. What would you drink? What would you drink this with? Maybe a steak, sandwich? I don't know.
Sure.
Beer pairing is now kind of a big thing, but the certain breweries have beer pairings when they have restaurants. So
I think it's good for after dinner.
Yeah, I think a sunshiny porch and a warm but day with a cool breeze. That's the right drinking for this beer.
There you go, kind of.
Or in a basement.
That's right.
Or in some guy's basement.
Some guy's basement.
There you go, recording a podcast. Well.
Okay, so that will do it for this retrospective on Sunflower Brew. This is only a small portion of the overall podcast. I thought it'd be really cool to share it and revisit in time for its 10th anniversary. So, I do have to give a special shout out to the podcast host, Zach Lulia, for approaching me with the idea and bringing me on board. It was quite a ride. And specific to the past hour, you heard segments of the podcast from the very first episode, which was Kyle Russell. Kyle at the time was head of the Johnson County Democratic Party, and believe it or not, you've already heard his voice on the podcast at least once when I shared the final recording we ever did for Sunflower Brew. Next, you heard part of our interview with Richard Marcellus, which is the episode that spawned that infamous photo where my Duke hoodie was deemed uncalled for. That's leading to the name of this podcast. The third segment you heard was from Jason Leib. Jason was our resident beer guru on the podcast, so we brought him in a couple times to mostly talk about beer and all the processes that go about in making beer. So very educational. Next up, Max Skidmore was I suspect he's long retired by this point, but he was, at the time we had him on, he was a political science professor at UMKC, and no, I did not have him as a professor staying there, but that's great. Next, we had the LGBT discussion with Jonathan Topryer, at the time working at UMKC, and Sean Galusha. Sean was actually in the student media with me, and I invited him to participate in the podcast, knowing full well that he identifies as LGBT. And thought that'd be a good episode for him to get on board with. Next was Nate Bucady, local sports radio personality, and probably my favorites of all the interviews we did. In fact, it was shortly after this specific interview that the Winning Side Coaches podcast started about the same time, and also something I got cut from this retrospective. Arsenal lost that opening day game to Aston Villa, and next up was 2 parts of our barbecue 4-parter. Guests were Jeremy Schleisman, apologies for if I mispronounced that, and Charlie Vinson, who are both barbecue judges. So the 2 parts we heard were specifically the ribs, which was part 2, and the brisket in part 4. And you heard from them, in competition, you turn in ribs curvy side down, to paraphrase Brian Boy. And then the next interview, unfortunately, was our last episode, but it was with Amber Forsola. Amber, who unintentionally inspired the name of this podcast when she called out my outfit as being uncalled for. And then the very last segment is me talking about a particular beer. It's from the episode we did with Megan England, and that one's always going to stick with me because that particular beer was a porter, which is a darker beer, and I, to this day, did not particularly care for the taste of this particular beer. If you're ever going to have me, if you're ever going to give me a beer, make a Budweiser or a Bud Lights or something like that, because that porter, it still felt like I was drinking a glass full of ashes. I don't know how much of the podcast is still available to download. I can tell you that we were doing the free Podbean RSS, so having to cycle through everything. That's the bad news. The good news is I still have all the episodes available to me, so if you are interested in getting all the episodes of Sunflower Brew, please feel free to contact me. And probably the best way to contact me, if you're listening to the podcast, is through our Facebook page, facebook.com/uncalledforpodcast. And once again, cannot thank Zach enough for this opportunity, because it really did kickstart, if you will, my path down the podcasting way. So, with all that said, I will talk to you next time.
This podcast is Uncalled For is hosted, produced and edited by Mike Chernevsky. Opening music is Fantasia by Kevin MacLeod at Incompetech.com, licensed under Creative Commons by Attribution 4.0 license. Outro music is Sunflower Brew theme music by Mike Chernevsky, created using Music Maker function in GarageBand. Additional music included Morocco Sting by Kevin MacLeod at Incompetech.com, licensed under Creative Commons by Attribution 3.0 license. Please like, share, and subscribe to the podcast through your favorite podcasting platform. Like our Facebook page at facebook.com/uncalledforpodcast, and check out our blog with show notes at uncalledfor.home.blog. Thank you so much for listening. We will see you next time.